He was a millionaire CEO with no time for emotions, until he caught a little girl secretly cleaning his office floor, and discovered a truth that shattered everything he thought he knew. Nicholas Hale didn't believe in accidents. To him, everything in life could be controlled, measured, predicted, if not by logic, then by numbers. He ran his company, Hale and Company, with the same precision that he applied to his personal life: tight schedules, zero distractions, and no emotional detours. At 36, he was one of the youngest self-made millionaires on the East Coast. His face appeared on magazine covers, his quotes were taught in business schools, and his office on the top floor of the Hale Tower was a glass and marble monument to everything he had built from nothing. He wasn't a man who looked back. He wasn't a man who got surprised. Until the night he saw the little girl with the red rag. It was late, well past office hours. A board meeting had run over, and Nicholas's private elevator was under maintenance, a rare and irritating disruption in his otherwise seamless routine. Annoyed, he took the side staircase down to the service level, intending to bypass the cluttered lower floors and slip out the back entrance. The hallway he entered was dim, lined with janitorial carts and mop buckets, the air sharp with the scent of cleaning chemicals. He had never walked this part of the building before. Normally, people cleared space for him. This time, he stepped into a world he had never been meant to see. And then he saw her. She couldn't have been more than 8. Blonde hair tied into a loose ponytail. Blue eyes wide and focused. She wore oversized yellow rubber gloves that nearly swallowed her arms and held a faded red rag in her hand. She was on her knees, scrubbing the marble floor, his marble floor. The scene didn't compute. Nicholas stopped mid-stride, his expensive leather shoes clicking once against the tile before going still. She looked up, startled but not afraid. He expected her to jump, to run, to explain herself with tears. But she didn't. She simply sat back on her heels and stared at him, panting slightly from the effort, her little chest rising and falling beneath a janitor's apron that clearly didn't belong to her. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. "I'm cleaning," she said. "My mom's sick. If I don't do her shift, she might get fired." Her answer left him speechless. This girl wasn't sneaking in to cause trouble or to play pretend. She was working. In a corporate skyscraper. Alone. At night. He crouched down, carefully, unsure of how to speak to a child who was doing something no child should be doing. "What's your name?" "Sophie," she said. "My mom's name is Leah. She works here. Usually at night." Nicholas felt the ground shift beneath him. Leah Brooks. He recognized the name from an employee roster, a contracted night cleaner from a third-party service. He had never met her, had no reason to. She existed in the fine print, like most of the people who scrubbed the fingerprints off his glass walls while he slept. Sophie wiped her forehead with the sleeve of her oversized sweatshirt. "I tried to finish the hallway. But the bucket's too heavy." Nicholas didn't know what to say. He, a man who had once given an impromptu speech to 3,000 investors with no script, now found himself speechless in front of an 8-year-old with calloused little hands. He stood up slowly and said the only thing that made sense. "Let me help." But the girl shook her head. "No. You'll get in trouble. Only staff is allowed to clean." He almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. He was the CEO. The entire building bore his name. Yet this child was so locked into a reality of rules and fear that she truly believed he could be punished for helping her. He took out his phone and called security, requesting the building manager immediately. His voice was quiet, but firm. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. Within minutes, 2 uniformed officers arrived, eyes wide when they saw who had made the request. Nicholas didn't explain. He didn't need to. He just stood next to Sophie, who by now had risen to her feet, arms crossed, as if bracing for punishment. I want to speak with the mother, Nicholas said. Tonight. She's at home, one of the guards said hesitantly. She called out sick. Find her, Nicholas replied. Make sure she's okay. And tell whoever runs the cleaning crew that a child was mopping the floor in a high-security tower. I want answers. The men nodded and rushed off, leaving Nicholas alone again with Sophie. He looked down at her, unsure what to say next. You don't have to finish the floor, he finally said. She looked up at him and whispered, but who else will? That question stayed with him long after she was gone. The next morning, Nicholas arrived at his office earlier than usual, a strange restlessness gnawing at him. He had barely slept, haunted not by spreadsheets or pending deals but by a small girl with yellow gloves and two old eyes. Sophie. He couldn't stop seeing her crouched on the marble floor, too calm for a child her age, too quiet. It was the kind of image that didn't belong in his carefully managed world of efficiency and logic. He had built a fortress of systems, policies, and delegation, and yet a single child had cracked something open in him that he couldn't explain. He called his assistant, Monica, into his office and asked her to track down everything she could about Leah Brooks. Within 10 minutes, Monica returned with a thin folder. Leah Brooks, age 29. Hired 2 years ago through a third-party cleaning agency contracted by the building management. Single mother. No emergency contact. 2 previous addresses. No complaints on record. No benefits. No healthcare. Minimum wage. Nicholas flipped through the pages in silence, barely registering the print. What struck him most wasn't what was in the file, it was what wasn't. There was no trace of her story. No line item for how many times she had gone to work sick. No field to document how many nights she brought her daughter with her because there was no one else. No space to record the quiet desperation of someone trying to survive invisibly. He picked up the phone and dialed the head of operations. He asked why children were allowed on cleaning shifts. The voice on the other end stumbled, stammered, and finally admitted that they'd seen the girl a few times, but didn't say anything because she wasn't causing trouble. Nicholas didn't yell. He simply said, make sure no child ever sets foot in this building with a mop in her hand again. Do you understand me? Then he hung up. The next call he made was to the agency. It took some persistence and his full name to cut through their defensive answers, but eventually, they admitted Leah hadn't reported for work because she was in bed with a high fever. They hadn't followed up. They assumed she'd be back when she could afford to be. Nicholas asked for her address. They hesitated, privacy policy. He didn't care. He said he would take full responsibility. Within an hour, he was in the back of a town car on his way to a small apartment in a forgotten corner of the city. The building was gray, water-stained, and barely insulated against the cold. He climbed 3 flights of stairs before knocking on door 3B. There was no answer at first. Then he heard a lock shift and the door cracked open. Leah Brooks stood there, pale and exhausted, wrapped in a blanket, confusion in her eyes as she realized who he was. I don't understand, she said, voice hoarse. Is something wrong with Sophie? She's fine, he said gently. But she shouldn't have been cleaning your shift last night. Leah closed her eyes, the weight of shame settling into her face. I know. I didn't want her to. I told her not to. But she thought if she didn't, we'd lose the job. I didn't know she'd actually go. Nicholas didn't speak for a moment. Then he asked, can I come in? She hesitated, then stepped aside. The apartment was clean but worn. A couch with patched cushions. A small kitchenette. Sophie's backpack hung by the door, her shoes neatly lined up underneath. On the table was a note written in childish handwriting, *, Mom, I'll be back. Love you. *. Leah sank into a chair. I've never taken her to work to clean. Never. But sometimes I bring her because I can't afford a sitter. And the neighborhood, well, I don't trust it. Nicholas sat across from her. He looked around and saw everything he'd never had to notice in his world of boardrooms and private jets. This wasn't neglect. This was survival. You shouldn't have to make choices like this, he said finally. She laughed, a bitter, exhausted sound. Tell that to the landlord, the utility company, and the school that called me 3 times this week because I didn't send in a field trip fee. He didn't know what to say. So he said the only thing he could. I want to help. Leah stiffened. We don't want charity. It's not charity, he replied. It's responsibility. Your daughter works harder than most grown adults in my building. She changed something in me. That matters. Leah looked at him for a long moment. Then she asked, why do you care? And Nicholas, a man who had never let emotion dictate a decision in his life, answered without thinking. Because she looked at me like I was supposed to fix it. And for the first time, I didn't know how. That was when he realized this wasn't about business anymore. This wasn't a case to be closed or a problem to be solved. This was a story he had walked into without meaning to, and now he couldn't walk away. Not from Sophie. Not from Leah. Not from the truth they had quietly been living while the rest of the world pretended not to see. Nicholas didn't return to the office that afternoon. For the first time in over a decade, he rescheduled every meeting, delayed every call, and shut down the non-stop rhythm of his calendar. He wasn't sure why he did it, only that something had shifted, and trying to force his life back into its usual structure now felt absurd. Instead, he drove to a small park near the edge of the city. He sat alone on a bench beneath an old tree, watching families pass by, listening to children's laughter drift through the air like echoes of something he'd never let himself want. For most of his life, he'd believed emotion was a liability. Efficiency, control, logic, those were the pillars of his empire. But Sophie, with her mop and her stubborn dignity, had broken through all of that. She hadn't begged, hadn't cried. She had simply worked. And she had looked up at him with a gaze that didn't see power or prestige, just a man who could do something and hadn't. He didn't know how to explain to himself why that mattered so much. Maybe it was because no one had ever looked at him that way before. Not his board, not his peers, not the partners who toasted to his brilliance at rooftop galas. Sophie had held him accountable in a way that was wordless and absolute. She had expected him to be better. And that expectation hadn't felt like a burden. It had felt like purpose. Later that evening, he returned to the apartment building. He knocked quietly on the door of 3B. This time, it was Sophie who answered. Her hair was damp from a bath, and she wore pajamas with tiny stars on them. She blinked at him for a moment, then smiled like it was the most natural thing in the world. You came back, she said simply. Of course, he replied. I said I would. She stepped aside and let him in. Leah was in the kitchen, folding laundry on the table. She looked surprised but didn't send him away. Maybe she had started to believe, just a little, that he meant what he said. I brought dinner, Nicholas said, lifting the bag he carried. I didn't know what you liked, so I got a little of everything. Sophie's eyes widened at the sight of neatly packed takeout containers. Leah hesitated, then nodded toward the table. I guess we can make an exception tonight. They sat together, the 3 of them, around that small chipped table under a flickering overhead light. Sophie talked the most, about school, about how she wanted to be an architect so she could build houses where kids never had to clean floors. Leah listened with a quiet pride that was almost too painful to watch. Nicholas said little but listened to every word like it mattered more than any quarterly report he had ever read. When dinner ended, Sophie climbed into Nicholas's lap without asking. She didn't curl into him exactly, just leaned back like he was a place to rest. He froze at first, startled by the casual trust. Then slowly, carefully, he put an arm around her. Leah didn't react. She just watched, her face unreadable. After a while, when Sophie had gone to her room and the apartment was quiet again, Leah poured 2 mugs of tea and slid one across the table to Nicholas. "You don't seem like the kind of man who has time for this," she said. "I didn't think I did," he admitted. "But now, I'm not sure what I've been making time for all these years." She studied him, tired but not bitter. "You're not responsible for us, you know." "I know," he said. "But I also know what it's like to build something from nothing. And I know what it feels like to do it alone. That girl, she shouldn't have to carry so much weight. You shouldn't either." Leah didn't respond for a long moment. Then she looked down into her tea and whispered, "You're not the man I thought you'd be." He smiled faintly. "Neither am I." When he left that night, Sophie hugged him at the door. Not a quick goodbye, but the kind of hug that said something wordless and important: "I see you. I trust you. Please come back." And he would. Because something had begun that night, something fragile, unspoken, but undeniable. Nicholas didn't know where it was going. He didn't have a plan. But for once in his life, he didn't need one. All he needed was to keep showing up. And for the first time in years, he wanted to. Nicholas began returning to the apartment regularly, at first under the quiet pretense of checking in on Leah's recovery and making sure Sophie was all right. But the truth, though he never admitted it aloud, was that he found himself drawn back by something deeper and less explainable than obligation. Each visit chipped away at the layers he had spent years building to protect himself from emotional involvement. It started with simple acts: bringing dinner, picking up medicine, fixing a broken doorknob. But over time, he stayed longer. He listened more. He laughed, sometimes. And he started to notice the silence in his own life by contrast. In Leah and Sophie's tiny, overfilled apartment, there was warmth and chaos and struggle, but also realness. His penthouse was a museum by comparison, cold, quiet, and filled with everything except meaning. One rainy evening, he arrived earlier than usual. Leah was on the couch, curled up under a blanket with a heating pad on her stomach, clearly still recovering. Sophie answered the door with wet hair and a towel around her shoulders, grinning at the sight of him as though he were a friend she'd known for years. She grabbed his hand without asking and led him to her room, a small space barely big enough for a bed and a bookshelf. The walls were covered in drawings, crayon blue buildings with names and numbers, sketches of homes with huge kitchens and treehouses and bedrooms labeled, "For kids only." He realized she had designed entire worlds in her mind, each one better than the one she lived in. She handed him a notebook. "This is my favorite," she said. Inside were dozens of plans. Some showed rooms for children who had no parents. Some had secret passageways and slides instead of stairs. But every single drawing included something near the front door, a welcome mat that read, "You are safe here." Nicholas sat on the edge of her bed, flipping through the pages. "You're very talented," he said sincerely. She shrugged. "I like building things. I want to make a place where kids like me don't have to work. Where they can just be kids." He nodded, then looked at her. "What do you mean, kids like you?" She blinked, then tilted her head like the answer was obvious. "Poor kids. The ones nobody helps. The ones people don't see." Those words sank into him like a stone dropped in still water. He had spent his whole career building skyscrapers, negotiating billion-dollar deals, acquiring companies, expanding reach, and yet he had never seen what a child like Sophie could see so clearly. He had walked past hundreds of people just like Leah and Sophie, thinking their struggles weren't his responsibility. He had believed his world was separate. Now he knew better. After she went to sleep, he joined Leah in the kitchen. She had made tea again, her hands wrapped around the mug like she needed it to anchor her. "She really likes you," she said without looking at him. "I like her too," he answered quietly. Leah finally met his eyes. "This isn't just a visit anymore, is it?" "No," he said. It's not. She exhaled slowly. So what is it, then? He hesitated. He hadn't defined it, not even to himself. But he knew one thing with certainty, he was invested. In Sophie. In Leah. In what their lives had become and what they could be. I don't know what it is yet, he admitted. But I know I want to be here. I want to help. Not just with groceries or bills. I want to give her a better life. And I think I want to be part of it. Leah looked away for a moment, her jaw tight. You have no idea what you're getting into. Maybe not, he said. But I've walked into boardrooms with less information than this and made it work. She let out a small laugh, surprised, reluctant, but real. Nicholas continued, voice steady. You've done more with nothing than most people do with everything. But you shouldn't have to do it alone. Leah's expression softened, her guard slipping just enough for truth to show through. I'm afraid of what she'll expect from you. What happens if you change your mind? If you disappear? I won't, he said. I can't promise I'll be perfect, but I can promise I won't walk away. There was a long silence, the kind that speaks louder than arguments or declarations. And then, as the rain tapped gently on the window, she nodded. That night, Nicholas left the apartment with something he didn't recognize at first. It wasn't just resolve. It wasn't pride. It was belonging. For the first time in his life, he was beginning to understand that building something meaningful wasn't about profit margins or clean designs. It was about staying when it was hard, showing up when it wasn't convenient, and choosing people over plans. And he knew then, whatever this became, however far it went, he was all in. The following few weeks passed with a rhythm that Nicholas had never known but quickly grew attached to. His days still began in conference rooms and ended with emails, but somewhere in between, they now included coloring books, grocery runs, broken toasters, and late-night math homework. He began stopping by Leah and Sophie's apartment regularly, not as a visitor, but as someone who belonged. He never said it aloud, and neither did Leah, but they both felt the shift. The apartment no longer felt like a place he passed through, it felt like somewhere he returned to. Sophie had begun treating him like a fixture in her life. She saved him drawings, greeted him with the same enthusiasm as if he'd been gone for a week even when it was only a day, and once proudly introduced him to a neighbor boy as, the guy who fixed the heater and also kind of acts like my dad sometimes. That sentence, spoken so innocently, had stuck with Nicholas like a seed buried in his chest. He hadn't earned the title. Not yet. But he felt the weight and possibility of it every time she looked at him like he was something solid in her life. And for once, he wanted to be. Leah, however, was more cautious. She never directly challenged his presence, but he could feel the quiet hesitations in her body language. She never asked for help but never turned it down either. She didn't thank him constantly, which he appreciated, it meant she didn't see him as some savior. She saw him as a man who had made a choice. And Nicholas knew that if he ever broke that choice, if he ever pulled away or left, he wouldn't just be hurting Leah and Sophie. He'd be proving that their world was still fragile, still temporary. So he didn't pull away. He stayed. One particular night, Sophie had trouble sleeping. Leah had fallen asleep early, still not fully recovered, and the apartment was quiet except for the ticking of the old kitchen clock. Nicholas sat in the living room reading reports on his tablet, but he set it down the moment he saw Sophie standing in the doorway of her bedroom in her star-patterned pajamas, holding her blanket like a shield. I had a bad dream, she said, barely above a whisper. Without needing instruction, he opened his arms, and she walked to him, crawling onto the couch beside him and curling against his side. He didn't speak, didn't ask questions. He simply wrapped his arm around her and waited. After a few minutes, she spoke again, softly, almost too quietly to hear. In the dream, Mom disappeared. And I couldn't find her. He looked down at her. Her eyes were open, but she wasn't really looking at anything. She was remembering something that probably wasn't just a dream. "She's here," Nicholas said gently. "She's not going anywhere." Sophie didn't respond. She just buried her face into his shirt. He sat like that for almost an hour, unmoving, holding her as she drifted back into sleep. At some point, Leah woke up and came into the living room. She stopped when she saw them, Nicholas sitting still in the half-dark, Sophie asleep in his arms, both of them breathing slowly and in sync. "She used to have those dreams a lot," Leah said quietly, moving to sit on the floor beside the couch. "I figured," Nicholas answered. "She's never gone to anyone else after," Leah added. "Only me." Nicholas didn't say anything for a moment. Then he looked at Leah. "I think she's starting to believe she's safe." Leah smiled, but there was something sad in it too. "She deserves to feel that. We both do. I just don't know if it'll last." "It can," he said, more certain than he had ever been about anything. "If we build it right." Leah nodded slowly. "That's the thing, isn't it? Building. Not just patching. Not fixing. Really building something new." Nicholas looked around the small, worn apartment and realized that despite the peeling paint and second-hand furniture, this place had become the foundation of everything that was beginning to matter to him. This was where he learned patience. Where he stopped thinking in bullet points. Where he started to feel human again. That night, after Leah carried Sophie back to bed, Nicholas stayed a while longer. He and Leah talked, about nothing, about everything. Their pasts, their fears, their futures. They didn't talk about labels, didn't try to define what was forming between them. But it was there, like the first outline of a house on a blueprint, no walls yet, no roof, but strong lines, careful lines, lines meant to last. When Nicholas finally left, the sky was beginning to lighten. He walked through the quiet streets with his hands in his pockets, his mind not on profit margins or contracts, but on Sophie's dream, and the way her breathing slowed when she knew someone was there. And in that quiet, he realized something that frightened him, but didn't make him turn away. He didn't just care about them. He needed them. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid to admit it. News never stayed quiet for long in Nicholas Hale's world, no matter how discreetly he moved. For weeks, he had been balancing two lives, his public one, where he was still the calculating CEO of Hale and Company, and his private one, where he spent evenings reading bedtime stories and learning how to braid Sophie's hair. But the moment a photograph surfaced, an offhand picture taken by someone in the elevator lobby showing Nicholas with a child holding his hand and a grocery bag in the other, speculation ignited. The media didn't care about the context. They only saw what they could sensationalize. "Secret daughter," one headline read. "Nicholas Hale's mysterious family life exposed," another claimed. Within 48 hours, the internet had built a full narrative around a child he hadn't even known existed 2 months ago. The reaction from his board was immediate and severe. Nicholas was summoned to an emergency meeting under the guise of concern about brand optics. He knew what that meant. It wasn't concern, it was fear. Fear that his personal involvement in something they couldn't control would compromise their polished, untouchable image. The conference room was filled with stiff voices and tight smiles. They all pretended to be curious, not confrontational, but Nicholas could see the judgment in their eyes. One of the directors leaned forward. "We understand this is a private matter, Nicholas, but the press is running wild with it. If there's something we need to clarify." Nicholas interrupted, calm but firm. "She's not my daughter by blood. But she's more mine than anything I've ever claimed in this company." The room fell into a strange silence. No one knew how to respond. They weren't used to him speaking like this, with conviction that had nothing to do with quarterly results. Another voice, colder this time, chimed in. "We're concerned about liability. About precedent. You're making decisions that blur the line between personal and professional." Nicholas folded his hands. "Good. That line should have been blurred a long time ago. Maybe if it had, we wouldn't be running a company full of policies but lacking humanity. Murmurs followed. Some exchanged glances. One board member even smirked in disbelief. Nicholas stood up, slow and deliberate. Let me be clear. If this company's definition of leadership is rooted in avoiding scandal instead of doing the right thing, then maybe I've been leading the wrong company. He walked out without waiting for their response. That night, when he arrived at the apartment, Leah was already aware of the fallout. The news had reached even their quiet corner of the city. She stood at the window, arms crossed, her face tense. They're tearing you apart in the press, she said. I know. You could lose your company. I know that too. She turned to face him fully. Then why are you still here? He took a step closer. Because what I found here is worth more than any board seat or executive title. I didn't expect it, but now that I have it, I'm not going back to who I was before. Leah's eyes softened, but she didn't speak. Not yet. I want to be part of this family, Nicholas continued. Whatever form it takes. Not just now. Not until the news quiets down. I want the long nights and the homework and the hard conversations. I want to be here when Sophie graduates 5th grade, when she builds her first model, when she forgets where she put her shoes for the 100th time. He stopped, then added, and I want to do it with you. Leah stepped forward slowly, her voice quieter now. You're not afraid. I'm terrified, he admitted. But I've been afraid of the wrong things my whole life. Losing control. Looking weak. Now I'm afraid of losing something real. They stood in silence, just inches apart, the hum of the city filtering in through the window. For Leah, trust was not something she gave easily, and for good reason. But she saw it now, the change in his eyes, the exhaustion in his posture that came not from work but from caring, the gentleness he had never needed in a boardroom but now wore like armor. He wasn't here for show. He wasn't here to fix them. He was here to stay. Finally, she nodded. Then stay. And he did. That night, as Sophie curled up beside him on the couch again, the television playing softly in the background, Nicholas realized he wasn't juggling 2 lives anymore. He was living one. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, he didn't feel divided. He felt whole. Autumn settled into the city with quiet certainty, painting the sidewalks in soft gold and the trees in deep rust. For Nicholas, the change in season felt symbolic. What had begun as a disruption to his perfectly curated life had grown into something far more permanent, something he hadn't planned for but had come to need. His world, once defined by deadlines and sterile hotel rooms, now included warm dinners cooked in a tiny kitchen, sticky notes from Sophie left in his coat pockets, and quiet nights spent with Leah on the couch, the television forgotten in the background. His penthouse remained empty most nights, his tailored suits increasingly replaced by sweaters and jeans worn comfortably among cluttered art supplies and school projects. Slowly, without declaration, he had moved into their lives not as a guest, but as someone expected. Wanted. Known. Leah, though still cautious, had allowed the walls around her to lower. Not all the way, there were still moments when she pulled back instinctively, when her eyes grew guarded in conversations that grew too intimate or hinted at permanence, but she had begun to let him carry some of the weight. She let him take Sophie to school. She let him sit in on parent-teacher meetings. And when she was tired, she let him hold her hand without feeling like it was charity. That kind of trust, Nicholas understood now, was more valuable than anything in his portfolio. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet. Earned. One evening, after a long day at the office he now barely recognized as his domain, Nicholas returned to the apartment with a large, flat box tucked under his arm. Sophie greeted him at the door with paint smudged on her cheeks and a grin that made the day's tension evaporate instantly. "What's that?" she asked, pointing at the package. He knelt beside her and opened it slowly. Inside was a custom-framed version of one of her drawings, the one she had proudly shown him weeks ago, the building with the sign that read, "You are safe here." He had scanned it, enhanced the colors, printed it on quality paper, and had it framed professionally. "This," he said, "is going on the wall. Right next to where everyone can see it." Sophie stared at it for a moment, her mouth parted in awe. Then she threw her arms around his neck with so much force that he nearly fell backward. Leah came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel, watching the scene with a softness in her gaze that she rarely allowed herself. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," he replied, glancing up at her. "But I wanted to." That night, they ordered pizza and ate it on the floor, watching an old animated movie that Sophie loved and Nicholas pretended he didn't enjoy as much as he did. Leah leaned against him, and when he wrapped an arm around her shoulder, she didn't pull away. Instead, she let her head rest there and closed her eyes for a moment. They didn't need to speak. The stillness between them was not empty. It was full, of effort, of forgiveness, of beginnings. Later, after Sophie was in bed, Nicholas and Leah sat on the small balcony, wrapped in a shared blanket, cups of tea warming their hands. The city glowed around them, soft, far away, no longer the center of his identity. Leah was the first to speak. "She keeps asking me if she can call you something else." He raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" "She doesn't want to say it unless you say it's okay." His chest tightened. "What is it?" Leah looked at him, eyes unreadable but full. "Dad." Nicholas was silent. For a moment, all the noise of the city, the weight of his past, the shame of what he had ignored for so long, came crashing down around that single word. Not because he didn't want it, but because he wanted it so much. "She doesn't need to ask," he said finally, voice rough. "She already does." Leah reached over and took his hand. They sat like that for a long time, the night cool and quiet around them. In that moment, Nicholas realized he had crossed a line he would never come back from, and he didn't want to. The man who once measured his value by power and influence now knew the worth of stillness, of being a safe place for someone small and brave, of being the one they ran to when the world felt too big. It was a kind of wealth he had never dreamed of. But now that he had it, he knew nothing else could ever compare. Winter arrived with a quiet hush, blanketing the city in white and slowing everything down, as if the world itself was taking a breath. For Nicholas, this season felt like a culmination, of change, of healing, of everything he never imagined he'd find in a cramped apartment with two people who had once been strangers. The walls of that little home were still worn and the kitchen faucet still dripped, but to him, it felt like the most extraordinary place on earth. It wasn't about what it looked like, it was about what had been built inside it. Love, trust, routine, laughter. It was the place he became someone new. Sophie had flourished. Where she once carried the silent weight of adult worries, now she danced through rooms with bare feet and wild hair, her laughter no longer guarded. She had begun calling him Dad in private first, at the kitchen table, when she wanted help with homework, or when she hugged him goodnight and whispered the word like it was both a question and a promise. Over time, it became natural, something that belonged to them both. Nicholas never corrected her. He didn't need to. Each time she said it, it healed something in him he hadn't known was broken. Leah had changed too. Her edges had softened, but not in the way that meant she had let her guard down completely. She had simply allowed someone else to stand beside her, not out of weakness, but out of strength. They worked as a team now, packing lunches together, splitting responsibilities, arguing about bedtime routines and grocery lists and how many coats a child really needed in New York weather. Their lives weren't perfect, but they were real. And they were shared. Nicholas had left the corporate world behind in pieces. The board hadn't taken his decision well when he resigned fully a month earlier, stating in a formal letter that his priorities had changed. They tried to offer him a reduced role, a consulting deal, even begged him to reconsider. But he didn't. He walked away from the life he had once protected so fiercely, not because it had no value, but because it simply wasn't the life he wanted anymore. He wasn't walking away from success, he was walking towards something far more personal, something more lasting. With part of his exit compensation, he funded a new initiative, a center designed for single parents and children struggling in low-income neighborhoods. It wasn't a charity with glossy brochures or gala dinners. It was a place where people could find real help, childcare, education programs, clean laundry, warmth. And at the front entrance, carved into the wood of the lobby desk, were words Sophie had drawn in one of her early blueprints: "You are safe here." He named the center after her, of course. Sophie's Place. On Christmas Eve, snow fell lightly outside as the three of them sat on the couch, wrapped in blankets, their small tree glowing in the corner. The apartment was filled with the smell of cinnamon and cocoa. Sophie handed Nicholas a gift she had made herself, wrapped in crinkled paper and sealed with far too much tape. He opened it carefully to find a framed picture of the three of them, printed on regular paper, with messy handwriting underneath that read, "My forever family." He didn't speak for a moment. His eyes stung in a way he didn't expect, and when he looked over at Leah, she was already smiling through her own tears. Sophie looked up at him, hopeful and a little nervous. "Do you like it?" Nicholas pulled her into a hug so tight it made her giggle. "I love it," he whispered. "It's the best gift I've ever gotten." That night, after Sophie went to bed, Leah stood in the kitchen rinsing dishes while Nicholas leaned against the counter watching her, the quiet warmth of the room settling around them like a blanket. "I've been thinking," he said softly. "Dangerous words," she teased, without turning around. "I want to adopt her. Officially." She froze, a plate still in her hand. Then she slowly turned to look at him. He could see the emotions flood her eyes: relief, joy, fear, something unnameable. "You really want to?" "I already have. In every way that counts. But I want her to know it's forever. On paper. In every way." Leah stepped forward, drying her hands on a towel. "Then let's do it." 2 months later, they stood in a family court, holding hands as the judge finalized the paperwork. Sophie sat beside them, wearing a dress she picked out herself, her eyes sparkling with something far too big for her tiny frame. When the gavel fell and the judge officially declared Nicholas her father, she clapped so hard she dropped the stuffed animal she'd brought with her. Afterward, as they stepped outside into the sun, Sophie grabbed his hand and Leah's and pulled them together. "Now we match," she said. And they did. Not because of blood or law, but because they had chosen one another. Through pain, through uncertainty, through late nights and hard truths. What they had built together was stronger than the past they came from. It was a home. It was a family. And it was forever. The ending of this story is a quiet triumph, not because everything becomes perfect, but because it becomes real. It doesn't rely on fantasy or exaggerated drama. Instead, it leans into something far more powerful: human growth, earned trust, and the healing that comes from showing up when it matters most. Nicholas doesn't just change, he evolves. He begins as a man defined by control and ends as someone who understands that the most meaningful structures in life are built not from steel or concrete, but from love, consistency, and vulnerability. Leah's journey is just as vital. She isn't saved by Nicholas, she holds her own ground, protects her daughter fiercely, and only lets him in when she sees that he's there not out of guilt or obligation, but out of genuine care. Their connection is built on slow-earned respect, not instant romance, which makes the ending feel grounded and honest. And Sophie, the heart of it all, doesn't just symbolize innocence, she symbolizes courage. The way she quietly endures, dreams, and dares to trust again is what gives the story its soul. What makes the conclusion beautiful is that the family they become is chosen. It's a love story, yes, but not just romantic. It's a story about choosing each other, again and again, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. That's what makes it not just satisfying, but unforgettable.